She was standing in the rain, 72 years old, a torn coat, a broken grocery bag at her feet, and not a single person stopped. Not one. People walked past her like she was a crack in the sidewalk, something you notice for half a second and then forget before you even reach your car. One woman glanced over, said something to her friend, and they both laughed. Laughed. At a 72-year-old woman on her knees in the rain, trying to pick up a can of soup that had rolled under a stranger's tire. And nobody, not one soul in that entire parking lot, thought to stop. Because when the world has already decided that someone doesn't matter, it becomes very easy to keep walking. It becomes almost automatic. And on that Tuesday afternoon in October, in the parking lot of a Fresh Mart grocery store in Denton, Ohio, the world had already decided about Eleanor Marsh. Except for one girl, 23 years old, minimum wage, 2 jobs, no reason in the world to stop. But she did. What none of them knew, not the people who laughed, not the ones who walked away, was that this woman in the torn coat was the mother of the wealthiest person on the planet. And in 30 days, every single life in that parking lot was about to change forever. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Now let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened in that parking lot and everything that followed, you first need to understand who Eleanor Marsh really was. Not the woman the world saw standing in the rain, the woman she had been before the rain, before the torn coat, before the silence between her and her son had stretched so long it had started to feel permanent. You need to understand where Eleanor came from, what she built, what she lost, and why. Even with $1 trillion one phone call away, she was standing in that parking lot alone. Because this story is not simply about wealth. It is not simply about kindness. It is about what happens when pride and pain and love all get tangled up together so tightly that not even a mother and her son can find the thread to pull. It is about the moment one young woman, exhausted, underpaid, behind on her tuition, carrying more than anyone her age should have to carry, made a choice that 8 seconds of hesitation might have erased entirely. And it is about what kindness costs, and what it returns, and why the people who laughed that day in the rain could never have imagined the world that was quietly being rearranged around them. Eleanor Marsh was born in 1952 in a town called Mill Haven, Kentucky, the kind of town that doesn't make maps unless there's been a disaster. She was the third of 5 children. Her father worked the mines, her mother cleaned houses. Eleanor was, by every account from people who knew her then, the kind of child who noticed things. She noticed when someone at school ate lunch alone. She noticed when a neighbor's curtains stopped moving. She noticed the space between what people said and what they meant. Her 3rd-grade teacher, in a letter that would surface much later, once wrote that Eleanor had the sharpest emotional intelligence I have seen in 30 years of teaching, wrapped inside a child who will not waste it on herself. That observation would prove to be one of the most accurate things anyone ever said about Eleanor Marsh. She left Mill Haven at 18 with $40, a cardboard suitcase, and a plan that existed mainly in her own conviction. She moved to Columbus, Ohio, took a job at a textile factory, and enrolled in night classes at the community college. She studied accounting, not because she loved numbers, she didn't, particularly, but because she understood, even then, that financial literacy was the only language powerful people consistently refused to teach to people like her. She wanted to be fluent. She wanted to know exactly what was being said in rooms she wasn't invited into. By 24, Eleanor was a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing firm. By 27, she had her associate's degree. And by 29, she was pregnant and alone, after the man she had believed in decided that fatherhood was an inconvenience his ambitions couldn't afford. She named her son William James Marsh. And from the moment she brought him home to their 1-bedroom apartment on the east side of Columbus, Eleanor made herself a promise that she kept every single day for the next 18 years. William would never feel the weight of what they didn't have. He would only feel the force of what they were building. William Marsh was, from the beginning, something different. Eleanor recognized it early, not with the blind optimism of a mother who thinks every child is exceptional, but with the measured clarity of a woman who had spent her life reading people accurately. William asked questions that looped back on themselves, questions that didn't have easy answers, and he was never satisfied with easy answers anyway. He built things, took things apart. By age 11, he had rewired the circuit breaker in their apartment building because the landlord kept ignoring the flickering lights, and an elderly man on the second floor was scared of the dark. He didn't tell anyone he'd done it. Eleanor only found out because the landlord came to thank her for her son's work, genuinely stunned that a child had solved something that had bothered the building for 2 years. That instinct, to see a problem, solve it quietly, and not wait for permission, would become the engine of everything William built. He received a full scholarship to Ohio State, where he studied computer science and economics simultaneously, which his advisors called ambitious and William called obvious. He graduated in 3 years, not because he rushed, because he had already started building what would become the early architecture of Marsh Integrated Systems, a company that began in a garage in Dublin, Ohio, and would eventually be valued at more than the GDP of most nations. He was 22 years old when he incorporated. Eleanor was working at a regional bank as a senior accounts manager, still living in Columbus, still taking the bus, still making sure William ate properly whenever he came home, which in those early years was every Sunday without exception. She was the first person he called when the company's first major contract came through. She was the first person he called when his first big pitch failed. She was, in the language of people who knew them both during those years, his anchor, not in the soft, sentimental way that word sometimes gets used, but in the literal, structural sense. When the current pulled, Eleanor was what held, and William knew it. He told people openly, in interviews during those early years, that his mother was the reason he wasn't afraid of failure. She built something out of nothing for 20 years, he said in one profile published when he was 28. When I'm scared, I think about her factory shifts, and then I'm not scared anymore. Now, here is where the story changes. And I want you to pay attention to how it changes, because it does not change with a scandal or a crime or a single dramatic moment. It changes the way most painful things change, slowly, quietly, one small compromise at a time, until one day you look up and the distance between where you are and where you started is so vast you can't imagine how you crossed it. William Marsh was 34 years old when he met Diane Colton. Diane was the daughter of a Boston investment family, a Harvard MBA, and a woman who moved through the world with the kind of effortless confidence that comes from never having had to fight for a seat at the table. She was sharp, she was strategic, and she was, in many ways, exactly the kind of partner that a man building a trillion-dollar company is told he needs. Eleanor met Diane twice in the first year of the relationship. She was polite, she noticed things, the way she always had, the way Diane's eyes moved around Eleanor's modest apartment when she visited, the micro-expressions when Eleanor talked about her factory years, the careful, practiced warmth that sat just slightly outside the range of genuine. Eleanor said nothing. She had not survived everything she had survived by saying everything she noticed. But 2 years into William's relationship with Diane, there was a dinner that Eleanor has described, in later accounts, as the night she understood that some doors, once they close, don't open again the same way. It was at a restaurant in downtown Columbus that cost more per plate than Eleanor's weekly grocery budget. Diane's parents were there, 2 of William's senior executives, and sometime between the appetizers and the main course, the conversation turned to the company's public image, its narrative, the story it told the world about itself. And Diane said, not cruelly, not even unkindly, in the smooth, managerial tone of someone making a business observation, that the company's image was one of cutting-edge innovation, and that it was important that every element of that image be consistent, including, she said, the family element, the personal story. She looked at Eleanor as she said it, just once. But Eleanor was a woman who had spent her life reading the space between what people said and what they meant. And she read it clearly. William said nothing. He looked at his plate. The conversation moved on. And Eleanor finished her meal, thanked everyone quietly, and went home on the bus. She did not cry on the bus. She looked out the window at the city she had lived in for 40 years, and understood, with the absolute calm of someone who has already survived the worst things, that her son had just made a choice. He hadn't said it out loud. He hadn't had to. She sent him a letter the following week, not an email. A letter, handwritten on the same yellow legal pad she had always used for important things. In it, she told him that she loved him. She told him she was proud of him in ways that language didn't have the right size for. She told him that she would not be at the engagement party, and that she would not be in the press releases, and that she would not be made into something she wasn't, for any reason, including love. She told him that she was returning the bank transfer he had set up. All of it. She told him she had her Social Security, her savings, and her dignity, and that all three were in good shape, and that he should not worry about her. She signed it, as she had signed every letter she had ever written him, since he was 7 years old and went to his first overnight camp. Your first fan. Always, Mom. William called 3 times that week. She answered once. She told him she meant every word. He told her she was being stubborn. She said, "You were raised by a stubborn woman. I'd think carefully before you use that as a criticism." And then she told him she loved him, and she hung up. That was 4 years before the parking lot. 4 years of birthday cards with no return address so he couldn't send them back. 4 years of Eleanor living on $1,400 a month, shopping at Fresh Mart on Clover Street with a coupon book she kept in her purse, taking the 38 bus every Tuesday, keeping her apartment the way she always kept everything. Small, clean, and entirely hers. She did not want for meaning. She volunteered at the Denton Public Library on Monday mornings, helping adults with low literacy practice reading. She had a neighbor, a woman named Ruth, who was 81 and couldn't drive, and Eleanor brought her groceries every Tuesday on her way home from Fresh Mart. She had a garden on her apartment's small balcony. Tomatoes, basil, one stubborn rosemary plant that had survived 3 Ohio winters. She went to church on Sundays, not because she was certain about God, but because she was certain about community. And church was one of the last places in America where strangers still sat together. Her life was not tragic. That is important to say clearly. Her life was not a tragedy, interrupted by a parking lot moment. Her life was a life, full, intentional, and chosen. The parking lot was just the moment the rest of the world finally paid attention. Now let's talk about Maya Collins, because Maya Collins is not a supporting character in this story. She is, in many ways, the center of it. Maya was 23 years old in the October this story takes place. She had grown up in Denton, Ohio, not the wealthy end, the other end, the end where the houses were small and the dreams were large, and the gap between those two things required a kind of relentless daily labor that most people looking in from outside would never fully understand. Her mother, Carol Collins, had worked as a home health aide for 22 years. Her father had left when Maya was 9. Not dramatically, no fight, no final scene, just a slow disappearance, less and less present, until one day he simply wasn't. Maya's older brother Marcus was in the army. Her younger sister Destiny was in 10th grade. Maya was, by the logic of her family structure, the one who held the middle together. She had been 2 semesters into her nursing degree at Denton Community College when her mother had a minor stroke. Not severe, Carol recovered well, was back to limited work within 4 months. But the medical bills were immediate, and the panic was immediate. And Maya had made the decision that felt at the time like the only decision available to her. She paused school. She picked up a second shift. She applied for every hour of overtime Fresh Mart would give her, and took dinner shifts at a diner called Patty's 3 blocks from the store. She had a plan to re-enroll the following fall. The following fall became the one after that. She was now 18 months out from that original pause, still working both jobs, still sending money home to help with her mother's prescriptions, still keeping a folder of course catalogs and scholarship applications on her kitchen table that she looked at most nights before she went to sleep. She was not bitter. That is also important to say. You might expect her to be, and she'd have been entitled to it, but Maya Collins was not built for bitterness. She was built, in some essential, foundational way, for attention, for noticing, for the kind of active presence in the world that makes a person stop in a parking lot when everyone else walks by. Her co-workers at Fresh Mart described her the same way, almost to the person, when reporters later asked, "The one you went to when something was wrong. The one who remembered your name and your mother's name and what was happening in your life. The one who made you feel like you were visible. 23 years old, holding 2 jobs, behind on a dream, and still the one who made everyone around her feel seen." On October 14th, she was 4 hours into a 6-hour shift. She had a 20-minute break starting at 4:10. She had planned to eat the sandwich she'd packed, check her phone, and spend 5 minutes outside in the air, because the store's ventilation system had been broken for 3 weeks, and the air inside had started to feel like it had already been breathed by everyone who'd ever worked there. She cut through the parking lot toward the small concrete bench near the cart return. That's when she saw Eleanor, she said later, in the conversation that would eventually be viewed over 40 million times, that she almost didn't stop. She said she was tired, in a way that had moved past physical. It's that kind of tired, she said, where your body keeps moving because it doesn't know what else to do, but your brain is already somewhere else entirely. She saw the woman. She saw the groceries on the ground. She saw the people walking past. She said she took 2 more steps, and then something in her, she couldn't name it exactly, she said, she still can't, just stopped. I thought, someone else will stop. And then I looked around and I realized nobody was going to stop. And that felt like the loneliest thing I had ever seen. She walked over. She crouched down in the rain without a second thought about her uniform or her shoes. She said, "Hey, let me help you with that," in the same voice you use with someone you already know. Eleanor looked up at her. Maya said the woman's eyes were extraordinary. Not sad, not grateful in the pleading way you might expect, just very steady, very present, as though she had long ago decided that the opinions of parking lots were beneath her consideration. Maya helped gather every item. She found a plastic bag in her jacket pocket, the reusable kind she'd been carrying for months, meaning to start using more, and she rebagged Eleanor's groceries carefully, making sure the bread wasn't under the cans. She asked Eleanor where she was headed. Eleanor said the bus stop on Clover. Maya said she'd walk her there. They walked together. Maya said Eleanor talked about the weather the way people do when they're not actually talking about the weather, as though it were a perfectly neutral subject when actually it was the easiest way to be in companionable conversation with a stranger without either of you having to perform anything. Eleanor asked Maya what she did. Maya told her. Eleanor asked if she liked it. Maya laughed. Not bitterly, she said, just honestly, and said she liked people, so she liked parts of it. Eleanor said that was a wise distinction. The bus was 12 minutes late. Maya stood with her at the stop, holding the umbrella she had in her bag over both of them, not because she planned to, but because it was raining, and Eleanor's coat was already wet, and the umbrella was right there. When the bus came, Eleanor thanked her. Maya said of course. Eleanor looked at her name tag. Then she looked at her face for a moment, in the way that Eleanor Marsh had always looked at the things she was determined to remember. And then, she got on the bus. Maya went back to work. She was 3 minutes late returning from her break. Her manager, a man named Phil, who operated entirely according to rules he had never examined critically, docked her 7 minutes of pay. She didn't mention Eleanor to anyone. She had not thought about it as a story worth telling. She had thought about it as a thing that needed doing, and so she had done it. What Maya did not know, could not have known, was that Eleanor had spent the 12 minutes on the bus thinking about her. Not in a calculating way, not in the way of a woman considering a transaction, but in the way Eleanor had always thought about people who surprised her, with a careful, attentive warmth, the way you hold something fragile to make sure you understand its full weight before you set it down. She noticed everything about Maya in those 15 minutes, the exhaustion around her eyes that had been there too long to be circumstantial, the way she laughed at her own situation without self-pity, that specific cadence of someone who is using humor not to deflect, but to stay upright. The name tag, the store, the way she said, "Let me help you," like it wasn't a favor, like it was just the next obvious thing to do, like the world was supposed to work that way, and she was just the one willing to act like it did even when it didn't. Eleanor got home. She made herself tea. She sat at the kitchen table where she had always made her most important decisions, and she thought for a long time. And then she did something she had not done in 4 years. She found her son's personal cell number. Not the number his assistant answered, the one that only 12 people in the world had, and she put it into her phone. She did not call it that night. She sat with it for 3 days. She watered her rosemary. She brought Ruth's groceries. She read to the adults at the library. And on the 3rd day, a Friday morning, at 8:15, she picked up her phone and she called. He answered on the 2nd ring. Not because he had been waiting. He hadn't known to wait. He answered because he always answered that number on the second ring, on the chance that it would one day be her. She had always known that. She said, "It's your mother." He said, "I know." And then neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted years. She said, "I need to tell you something that happened. And then I need to ask you something. And I need you to listen before you respond. Can you do that?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Good. Because some things are important enough to say once, and I'm only saying them once." The call lasted 51 minutes. William Marsh canceled 2 meetings, a video conference with a Singapore investment group, and a lunch with his COO. His assistant, who had worked with him for 9 years and had seen him walk out of board meetings without apology, said she had never seen him clear his schedule so completely, so quickly, with such a particular look on his face. Not panic, not crisis, but the look of someone who has just heard a sound they've been afraid they might never hear again. We don't have a transcript of the call. What we know comes from accounts given later by Eleanor herself, and they are characteristically precise without being complete. She told him about the parking lot. She told him about Maya Collins. She told him about the people who had laughed, and the people who had filmed, and the people who had kept walking as though she were invisible. She did not tell him these things to make him feel guilty. She was specific about that. She told him because she said it was the clearest picture she knew how to show him of what the world actually looked like when you were no longer useful to it. And then she told him about Maya. The way she'd said, "Let me help you," like it was obvious. The umbrella, the 3 minutes of docked pay, the nursing degree on pause, the folder of scholarship applications on a kitchen table that Eleanor had never seen but could imagine exactly. And then she said, "I'm not asking you to fix me, William. I'm asking you to pay attention." There was a long silence, and then she said, "And I'd like to see you." He said, "I'll be there tomorrow." She said, "I know." She didn't say anything else. She hung up. She stood at her kitchen window for a while, looking at the rosemary, and then she got her coat and went to the library, because it was Monday and she had people waiting. William Marsh was on a private jet to Columbus before 10 o'clock the next morning. He did not bring his assistant. He did not bring security. He brought himself, a bag for 2 nights, and a level of clarity that he would later describe, in terms unusually raw for a man of his professional composure, as the feeling of finally not being confused about what mattered. He took a car to Eleanor's apartment. He hadn't been inside it in 4 years. She had the same kitchen table, the same yellow legal pads, the same rosemary still alive, still growing, 3 Ohio winters deep. She made him coffee, and she sat across from him, and they looked at each other for a moment, in the way of people who have rehearsed what they're going to say so many times that when the moment arrives, they've forgotten all the words and are left with just the truth. He said, "I should have said something at that dinner." She said, "Yes." He said, "I don't have an excuse." She said, "I know." He said, "I've been sorry every day." She said, "I know that too." And then she poured his coffee, and she asked him what he'd been working on, and he told her, and she listened the way she had always listened, fully, without her phone on the table, asking the questions that made it clear she had understood everything he'd said. They talked for 3 hours. At some point it stopped being a reconciliation and became just a conversation. 2 people who knew each other deeply, catching up on the time that had passed between them, finding that the essential things were still intact under everything that had accumulated on top. At the end of the 3 hours, William said, "Tell me about Maya Collins again." Eleanor told him. He listened. He said, "You want me to do something." Eleanor said, "I want you to notice someone who did something that deserved to be noticed. What you do with that noticing is your business." He said, "What store?" She said, "Fresh Mart on Clover Street. Morning shift. Name tag says Maya." He looked at his mother for a moment. Then he nodded. Then he said, "I also want to talk about something else." She said, "What?" He said, "Diane and I ended things 8 months ago." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry." He said, "Are you?" She looked at him steadily. She said, "I'm sorry it hurt. That's real. The rest isn't mine to comment on." He said, "That's a very careful answer." She said, "I'm a very careful woman." He almost smiled. It was the closest to his old laugh she had heard from him in years. 2 days later, on a Wednesday morning, a man in a plain gray jacket walked into the Fresh Mart on Clover Street in Denton, Ohio. No entourage, no security visible, though there were two people outside who were very professionally not standing out. He moved through the store slowly, the way someone does when they're not actually shopping but don't want to look like they're looking for someone. He found her in aisle 7, restocking cereal boxes on the upper shelf from a ladder, her hair pulled back, her uniform slightly too big because Fresh Mart hadn't ordered the right size and she'd stopped asking. She climbed down. He was standing there. She said, "Can I help you find something?" He said, "Actually, I was looking for you." She said, "For me?" He said, "Are you Maya Collins?" She said, "Yes." Cautiously, the way you say yes to an unfamiliar question when you're not sure yet if it's good news or bad news. He said, "My name is William. I think you helped my mother last week in the parking lot." And Maya Collins, who had not once thought of that afternoon as anything other than the obvious thing a person does, went very still. She said later that the first thing she felt was not shock. It was something closer to relief, the feeling of having done a small, private thing and having it witnessed anyway, not publicly, but by someone it mattered to. She said, "Is she okay, your mother?" He said, "She's doing well. Better, actually." Maya nodded. The line at register 4 was starting to build. William Marsh looked at the register, and then at the growing line. And then he did something that would be repeated in every retelling of this story. He walked to the front of the line, introduced himself to the customers waiting, said he was going to need 5 minutes of their time with this cashier, and offered to pay for everyone's groceries. 4 people. 2 of them looked at him with the particular skepticism of people who have been offered things before that turned out to cost more than they saved. But he was already talking to Maya again, quietly, standing to the side, and Phil, the manager who had docked Maya's pay, had come out of the back office and was standing at the edge of the floor with the expression of a man trying to figure out if he was about to be fired or promoted. William asked Maya if she had a few minutes when she was next on break. She said she had 17 minutes starting at noon. He said, "I'll be here." He bought a coffee and a granola bar and he sat at the small table by the store's entrance and he waited. 12 minutes later, Maya sat across from him with her sandwich, and they talked for 17 minutes. He did not make a scene. He did not produce a check. He asked her about her nursing degree, about her mother, about how long she'd been at the store, about what her plan looked like. He asked questions that were thoughtful and specific. The same kind of questions his mother had always asked. The kind that made it clear you were actually listening to the answers. When the 17 minutes were up, Maya stood to go back. William said, "I'm going to look into some things, if that's all right with you. No promises yet. I just want to look into some things." Maya said, "You don't have to do anything." He said, "I know. My mother raised me to know the difference between obligation and choice. This is a choice." Maya looked at him for a moment. She said, "She sounds like she's something." He said, "She is. She's everything." Over the next 3 weeks, things moved in the way that things move when a person with nearly unlimited resources decides to pay careful attention. Not loudly, not with announcements or press releases or viral posts. Quietly, the way Eleanor had always done things. The way she had built her whole life, with intention and without fanfare, and with absolute consistency. William's team reached out to Denton Community College's nursing department to ask about gap year scholarship structures for working students. They reached out to a healthcare nonprofit in Columbus that William's company had previously funded. They built, piece by piece, the architecture of something specific, something that would hold, not just for Maya, but for the category of people Maya represented. The ones who were this close, who had done almost everything right, who needed one thing to shift slightly so the whole structure could stabilize. But before any of that became public, something else happened. Something nobody planned and nobody could have prevented, because the modern world has very little patience for events that don't become content. One of the 3 people who had filmed Eleanor in the parking lot that Tuesday afternoon, not maliciously anymore, just reflexively, had uploaded 7 seconds of footage to a social media account under a caption that said something vague and dismissive about people not watching where they're going. That 7 seconds spread. Not immediately, it took 11 days to find the right current, and then it spread the way things spread when they hit something true. Fast, and in every direction at once. In the footage, you can see Eleanor falling. You can see the groceries scattering. You can see people walking past. And in the last 2 seconds, at the very edge of the frame, you can see a figure in a Freshmart uniform crouching down. You can't see her face, but you can see the motion of someone choosing, clearly and without hesitation, to stop. That image, the blurred edge of a choice, captured something people recognized. Comments flooded in. Who is she? Who is the woman who stopped? The footage was reshared millions of times before the person who posted it even realized what had happened. And then a journalist in Columbus, young, thorough, the kind who still makes phone calls instead of just sending emails, started making calls. The story that published 2 weeks after that video began spreading was careful and accurate, which is rarer than it should be. It named Eleanor Marsh. It named Maya Collins. It described the parking lot, the rain, the groceries, the people who walked past. It described the phone call Eleanor had made, and the jet William Marsh had taken to Ohio, and the conversation in Eleanor's kitchen with the rosemary on the windowsill. And it described, with the specificity of good journalism, the thing that had actually happened in that dinner 4 years ago, the comment about the company's image, the silence, the letter on yellow legal paper. Eleanor had given the journalist permission to include it. William had not asked her not to. He had read the piece before it published, and he had said, through his communications team, only that he had no comment, because anything he could say would be insufficient, and he preferred to let his actions speak instead. The piece went everywhere. The response split almost immediately in the way that internet responses do. Some people focused on William Marsh, on the years of silence, on the question of what kind of son allows his mother to live that way. Some people focused on Eleanor, on her choice to refuse the money, on what kind of person walks away from $1 trillion on principle. Some people focused on Maya, on the parking lot, on the simple and complete fact of the umbrella held over a stranger in the rain. And some people focused on the woman who had laughed, whose face, unlike Maya's, was clearly visible in the footage, whose employer, a regional retail chain where she worked as a district manager, began receiving calls within hours of the piece going live. Her name was Sandra Wells. She was 47 years old. She had a LinkedIn profile with a professional headshot and a summary that used the word community 4 times. She had a 17-year-old daughter and a husband who coached high school baseball and a life that was, by every visible measure, completely ordinary. She had laughed in a parking lot at a woman on her knees in the rain, in the automatic, unconsidered way that people sometimes do when they have forgotten that the people around them are real. She had not thought about it since. She had not known there was footage. She had not known, obviously, who Eleanor Marsh was. She was not a villain. She was something slightly more uncomfortable than a villain. She was a person who had done a recognizably human and deeply unkind thing, caught in a moment of perfect clarity, with no context that softened it, and no good explanation available. She did not lose her job immediately, but within 72 hours of the story publishing, her company had issued a statement expressing that their values were those of dignity and respect, which is the corporate way of communicating that something has to happen, and then something happened. Sandra Wells resigned. She released a statement that was clearly written with legal guidance, careful, remorseful, without being specific, expressing that she had reflected deeply and recognized her behavior had fallen short of the person she wanted to be. Whether that was true in any felt sense, only Sandra Wells could know. But she said it, and it was in the permanent record, and the parking lot was also in the permanent record, and whatever she does next, she will carry both. In the weeks after the story published, Eleanor gave one interview, one, to a journalist she chose, conducted at her kitchen table, with a cup of tea she made herself. She was asked how she felt about everything that had happened, the viral footage, the public attention, Sandra Wells's resignation, the outpouring of public support. She said, "I feel like I went to get groceries and the bag broke. Everything else is what other people did with that." She was asked whether she had expected any of this. She said, "I expected my son to show up. That was all I expected. Everything else is extra." She was asked what she wanted people to take from the story. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want people to think about who they walk past." I don't mean that as a judgment. I mean it as a question. Because we all walk past people. The question is which ones you stop for, and why, and whether you'd make a different choice if you knew what you know now. She was asked about Maya. Her face changed in the way faces do when the subject is something that costs something real to talk about. She said, "That girl stood in the rain for 12 minutes, so I wouldn't have to stand alone. She didn't know me. She didn't know anything about me except that I needed help. That's not an act of charity. That's an act of recognition. She recognized that I was a person. Some days that's the rarest thing in the world." In the spring of the following year, the Eleanor Marsh Foundation was formally established. Its initial focus was three areas: literacy programs for adults in rural and post-industrial communities, gap year scholarship funds for nursing and healthcare students at community colleges in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, and a fellowship program for older adults living in isolation, connecting them with volunteer visitors, transportation assistance, and community resources. The Foundation's first major grant recipient in the scholarship program was a working student named Maya Collins, who re-enrolled in the nursing program at Denton Community College the following January and completed her degree 22 months later with honors. Maya did not move away from Denton. She works at a pediatric clinic on the east side of Columbus, 45 minutes from where she grew up, close enough to bring her mother groceries on Tuesdays, which she does. She and Eleanor still talk on the phone every Sunday. Eleanor does most of the talking. Maya does most of the listening, which Eleanor says is exactly the right balance. They have had dinner twice. Once at Eleanor's kitchen table, once at a restaurant that Eleanor chose and insisted on paying for, which Maya fought against and lost, because Eleanor Marsh has never lost an argument about who pays for dinner. William Marsh moved his company's Ohio regional headquarters to Columbus. He didn't make an announcement about why. People who knew him understood. He has dinner with his mother on the first Sunday of every month. He brings her rosemary plants, which she accepts, and then rolls her eyes about because she has 4 of them now, and they are beginning to take over the windowsill, but she keeps every one. He has, by accounts of people who work closely with him, changed in the specific way that people change when they've been reminded of something they almost forgot. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently, in the small daily choices that accumulate into character. He is less patient with performance and more patient with people. His assistant said, 6 months after the parking lot story, that he had started answering his own phone more often. She said it like it was a small thing. It wasn't a small thing. Here is what I keep coming back to when I think about this story. And I've thought about it a great deal, because it resists the simple shape that stories like this are supposed to take. It is supposed to be a story about a girl who did something good and was rewarded for it. And it is that. It is supposed to be a story about a mother who held her line and was ultimately proven right. And it is that too. It is supposed to be a story about the consequences of cruelty and how the parking lot moment found its way back to Sandra Wells and the others who kept walking. And yes, it is also that. But the thing I actually can't stop thinking about is smaller than all of those things. It is the 17 minutes, the break that Maya Collins had, the 17 minutes she spent sitting across from William Marsh with her sandwich, answering questions about her nursing degree and her mother and her plan, while Phil watched from the back office, and the line rebuilt itself at Register 4. In those 17 minutes, Maya did not perform gratitude. She did not perform surprise. She answered his questions the way she always answered questions, directly, specifically, without embellishment, without diminishing anything. She told the truth about her life, in the way of someone who has decided that her life is worth telling the truth about. And William Marsh, who had spent the last decade in rooms full of people performing things for his benefit, recognized it immediately. He recognized it because his mother had raised him to recognize it, and his mother had raised him to recognize it because she had spent her whole life practicing it herself, even when, especially when, it cost her something. This is not, in the end, a story about what wealth can do when it decides to be generous. That would be a much smaller story. This is a story about what it costs to stay true to who you are when the world keeps offering you easier versions of yourself. Eleanor Marsh stayed true, in a parking lot and at a dinner table 4 years before it, and in a one-bedroom apartment in Denton, Ohio, with a coupon book and a rosemary plant and a son she hadn't spoken to in 4 years, whose number she kept in her phone, because love and estrangement are not mutually exclusive, and any mother will tell you that. Maya Collins stayed true, in a parking lot, on a break she couldn't really afford to spend on a stranger, with an umbrella she happened to have in her bag, and a name tag that said her name, and a choice she made without knowing what it was the beginning of. And William Marsh found his way back to true, not because of the story, not because it went viral, not because the world was watching, but because his mother called on a Friday morning and said, "I need to tell you something, and I'm only saying it once." And he listened. The parking lot on Clover Street still exists. It still rains in October in Denton, Ohio. People still walk past each other every day, making 100 small choices about who to see and who to walk past and what it costs to stop. The answer to that last question has not changed. It costs very little. It almost always costs very little. The return on it, as one particular Tuesday afternoon demonstrated in ways nobody planned and everybody saw, is something else entirely. What would you have done? If you had been in that parking lot, if you had been the one walking past, or the one laughing, or the one with a broken grocery bag in the rain, what would you have done? I'm asking you genuinely, not to make you feel guilty, and not to make you feel certain, and not to give you an easy answer to type in the comments, because this story ended well. I'm asking because the parking lot moment happens every day, in 100 different shapes, and most of them don't go viral, and most of them don't have a trillionaire's mother at the center, and most of them just end with someone standing in the rain alone. And that matters just as much. It matters just as much. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that. If this story moved you, share it. Not for the numbers. Share it with someone who needs a reminder today that the smallest choices are the ones that build a life, and that kindness is not a transaction, it is a practice, and like any practice, it starts with showing up when you don't have to, in the rain, when nobody else is stopping, and holding out your hand. And if you're not subscribed yet, please do, because next week we have a story that begins in a hospital waiting room and ends in a courtroom, and the twist at the center of it involves two people who met once before, 30 years earlier, under circumstances neither of them ever expected to revisit. You will not want to miss it.